Selama puluhan tahun, dunia mengukur pertumbuhan ekonomi melalui PDB atau Produk Domestik Bruto. Akibatnya, sejumlah aspek seperti kesejahteraan, kualitas lingkungan hidup, dan keadilan sosial menjadi terabaikan. Kini, Global Green Growth Institute atau GGGI tengah mendorong implementasi pertumbuhan ekonomi yang lebih menyeluruh. GGGI adalah organisasi antar pemerintah yang mendukung upaya Indonesia menuju pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau. Gerakan ini bertujuan mewujudkan pertumbuhan yang berkelanjutan dengan memperhatikan kelestarian alam dan pemerataan hasil pembangunan bagi seluruh masyarakat. Untuk mewujudkan hal ini, GGGI dan Badan Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional Bappenas bekerjasama menjalankan Green Growth Program atau Program Pertumbuhan Ekonomi Hijau. Pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau di Indonesia dapat dicapai dengan mengintegrasikan pertumbuhan ekonomi yang ramah lingkungan dengan proses perencanaan pembangunan di daerah, dengan memperhatikan aspek geografis, ekonomi, sosial, dan budaya. Program pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau di Indonesia dimulai pada 2013 melalui program multifase. Fase pertama berlangsung pada tahun 2013 hingga 2015 dan mencakup sejumlah hal, antara lain menyelaraskan pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau dalam perencanaan pembangunan dan mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca akibat deforestasi dan degradasi hutan. Sedangkan fase kedua yang berlangsung dari 2016 hingga 2019 berfokus pada stimulasi investasi hijau dalam 3 wilayah kerja. Pertama, bidang energi yang akan fokus pada energi terbarukan dan efisiensi energi. Berikutnya, kawasan ekonomi khusus yang berfokus pada proyek-proyek infrastruktur hijau. Terakhir, mitigasi berbasis hutan dan lahan yang akan menggerakkan dan mendanai program dan proyek RED+.
In the next 5 years, our National Development Plan targets green investment of up to $100 billion or around 1.3 thousand trillion rupiah. This investment will be made in many busy sectors, including investment in clean energy, climate resilient infrastructure, sustainable forestry and fisheries, ecotourism, and smart cities.
Selain membantu mencapai target pembangunan nasional, program pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau juga sekaligus menempatkan Indonesia sebagai pelopor pertumbuhan ekonomi hijau di kawasan ASEAN. Grafiardi Kresnantyo, CNN Indonesia.
Dan kita kali ini berjumpa dengan Yvo de Boer, Director General of GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute, yang sekarang ini sedang berada di Jakarta. Hello Yvo, it's good to have you here in Jakarta. Now, Global Green Growth Institute, and for our audience who don't really know what it is, perhaps give us a little overview of what GGGI is and why was it actually created or set up as an institute?
It was probably created to reconcile some very major differences that we're confronted with as society and as humanity. In the sense that, on the one hand, we live in a world which is very short-term in its orientation. And what I mean by that is that most investors are interested in quarterly figures from companies, so they're looking 3 months ahead at the performance of a company.
Short-term profit.
Short-term profit. The lifetime of most CEOs nowadays is about 2 to 3 years, so they need to show a result in 2 to 3 years. And if you happen to choose a political career, then you're really lucky if you survive for 4 years. So that means that investors, business people, politicians have really a very short-term focus of 3 months, 2 years, or 4 years. At the same time as humanity, we're confronted with some really major long-term problems, issues like climate change, energy security, food security, water security, ecosystems loss, deforestation, urbanization, wealth increase. So some very big or major global trends that will have an impact over the longer term. And the challenge that we really face is to reconcile those two issues. How can you find an alignment between short-term thinking and long-term challenges? And the concept of green growth is really all about how can you define a model of economic growth, how can you define a model towards prosperity that brings strong economic growth, but in a way that is more socially inclusive, so brings real benefits to people in society, while at the same time doing less or hopefully no damage to the environment. So the concept of green growth is really all about trying to address long-term global trends, but in a way that is also comprehensible and understandable to poor people in society, to business people and to politicians.
But then how does it work? I mean, you mentioned this, the business and the politicians, and also, you know, the society in general, for example, and working within that short term space, so to speak, and short-term investment. So where does the GGGI come into this, and how does it actually work, especially when it comes to partnering, say, for example, with short-thinking institutions like the government or, you know, short-thinking investors?
Well, what we do as an organization is work with governments, really as partners to governments, as advisors to governments, to help them to explore and then implement different models of economic growth that are greener. And perhaps it's easiest if I give a couple of examples. One example is that we've just finished work with the United Arab Emirates, which is a country, a series of emirates that rely very heavily on oil and gas for their economic prosperity. And we have worked with them on a green growth strategy that allows them to take a different model of growth. And what we've come up with is a solution that actually shows stronger growth from an economic perspective, but at the same time introduces efficiency into the economy, introduces conservation into the economy, around energy, around water, around waste, around transportation systems, around different kinds of jobs. So there we've really shown that you can have the same degree of economic growth, but at the same time in a manner which is more environmentally friendly. Another example is from Africa, Ethiopia, which we've been working with for a number of years. Ethiopia is now one of the poorest countries in the world. It wants to be a middle-income economy by 2025, but it wants to achieve that without increasing its emissions of greenhouse gases. And what we've been doing with Ethiopia in terms of economic development, city development, agricultural development, forest restoration, is looking at how can you grow your economy, how can you eradicate poverty, how can you give more people good jobs, but at the same time ensure that your greenhouse gas emissions don't go up. So those are two examples of what we try and do in practice.
So you partner with governments and countries that actually ask you to, GGGI, to help, or how does it actually work? Is there sort of membership, and you know, how did you get to be part of the GGGI partnership program?
Well, we're owned by governments. We're an international, a treaty-based international organization, so our shareholders, our owners are governments, and one of those governments is the government of Indonesia, which is actually a founding father or founding mother of GGGI. So those countries determine what we do as an organization, and those are the countries that we work with. In the case of Indonesia, we work entirely on a program which is determined by the government. We work very closely with Bappenas. We work together with a number of other ministries. We work together with provincial governments on their agenda, on their journey to discover how green growth can be an alternative to brown growth.
So funding also comes from various countries, from the governments of these countries. Is that how it works?
Funding comes from the member governments, including from the government of Indonesia, which is one of our financial contributors. So that's what makes the in-country programs possible.
Okay, now let's look at the need, because, you know, we've talked you know, with COP21, for example, and then also we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's this feeling that we cannot ignore sustainability and the environment and green growth in the way we do business, in the way we govern, and in the way we live. Now, as you see across the globe, you know, do you see there is this sense of urgency in countries to move along that path of growth and sustainability, especially given, for example, I mean, we are facing climate change. It's real. I mean, the floodings everywhere, there's droughts and so on and so forth. But is there that sense of crisis that we need to do something now? You can see it and you can feel it, and countries are acting on these things?
I have the feeling that there's a growing sense of urgency, that there is an increasing recognition of global issues like climate change and sustainability. That's why the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. That's why we saw an agreement on climate change in Paris. But at the same time, many countries, including many developing countries, are still struggling with the question, how do we reconcile addressing the environment on the one hand with poverty eradication and economic growth on the other? And our challenge as an organization is really to find an alignment between those two, to show that you can grow economically, that you can eradicate poverty and protect the environment at the same time. And that is a challenge that many countries, including Indonesia, are still trying to understand.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a dichotomy. There's always, in order to grow, you have to, sacrifice the environment. But that's not the case, right? But is this something that, when we talk about Indonesia, for example, did you see that it's already now mainstreamed as part of the economy that Indonesia is, basically developing towards?
I mean, you point in your question to a very real struggle. The fact or the question, is it possible to grow economically without sacrificing the environment? And in fact, if you look around you, if you look at the examples of industrialized countries, if you look at the examples of China, maybe even India, all of those countries have increased prosperity by degrading their environment. So all of the environments, all of the examples that are out there are actually pretty negative examples from an environmental point of view. And the challenge is to show that there is a different path possible. And fortunately, we are beginning to see that reality. For example, investments in renewable energy have overtaken investments in fossil fuel-based energy. And in fact, investments in renewable energy in developing countries have overtaken investments in renewable energy in industrialized countries. And many countries are discovering new models of economic growth. But it's not easy. I mean, if green growth was easy, you wouldn't need a global green growth institute.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because at the moment, with the drop in the price of fossil fuels, for example, what is the excitement when it comes to renewables in general? Is there an incentive towards it? Because there's always a concern that renewable it's a lot more expensive and a lot more long-term investment. At the same time, the price of oil is dropping down with shale oil and so on going on in the world. I mean, how do you see that economic development going?
Well, one question, I suppose, is how do you define cost? If you say that the cost of fossil fuels is low, that's correct from a financial, traditional economic point of view, but the social and environmental cost associated with burning fossil fuels is huge and largely not recognized or ignored. For example, if you look at the health-related cost of poor air quality in China, that is massive. The same is true in India, in Korea, in many rapidly industrializing countries. And the problem at the moment is when we calculate the price of things like fossil fuels versus renewables, that we don't look at the broader environmental and health cost. But leaving that aside, yes, the cost of fossil fuels is very low today, but the cost of fossil fuels was very high 2 years ago and maybe very high again in 2 years' time. So one of the things that energy investors look at is the long-term price picture. If I make an investment in a certain direction, what is going to be the return over a longer period of time? And if I compare fossil fuels to renewable energy, there are a couple of differences that are striking. The first is that to build a coal-fired power plant is relatively cheap, but you have to keep putting coal into the thing for 20 to 30 years, and you don't know what the price of coal is going to be. The cost of a wind farm is very high, but once you've built it, it runs on wind. You don't have to put any fuel into it. So that's one of the considerations. Now, not only is the price of fossil fuels very low at the moment, the cost of capital is very low at the moment as well. In Europe, interest rates are even negative. So even though the cost of fossil fuels may be low at the moment, it's interesting for an investor to say, well, money is cheap. If I invest in a wind farm, I can borrow very cheaply at this moment in time, and then I can run the farm for 30 years on air. And that means that the investment perspective is changing as well.
China, as one of the, the major economic powerhouse in the world, and also when it comes to industrializations and their practices when it comes to actually exploiting resources. I mean, we rely a lot on China, for example, but what is happening there with China when it comes to following the green growth path? Are they doing the right things? I mean, especially when it comes to what's happening there in terms of pollution, in terms of soil degradation, and as well as all the other major climate issues that they're facing.
My sense is that there is a growing recognition in China that that economic model is broken. The economic model of China has been to take the natural resources of the world, convert them into products in China, sell those products to the West, and the pollution and the profits get left behind. Unfortunately, a lot of pollution gets left behind. And that, I mean, we're in a situation in parts of China now where you can't breathe the air, you can't drink the water, the soil is so polluted that you can't even use it for agriculture. Plus China, I think, recognizes that it can't continue to assume all of the world's resources are at its disposal for its economy. So China is trying to shift the model of its economic growth away from industrialization and production, more towards a service-oriented economy, more towards innovation, more towards capitalizing on green growth, for example. So that shift is beginning to happen in China, not entirely motivated by a love of the planet or strong green feelings, but recognition that China is under pressure from those global trends that I talked about earlier on. So things are changing in China. They're changing slowly in China. On the one hand, all the new power generation that China is adding at the moment, well, most of it has been renewables, but at the same time, there's still an awful lot of coal-based power generation in China. So it's not entirely a green story yet, but it is a movement in the right direction.
But what are the main challenges when it comes to working together with governments, especially in countries that still prioritize the economic growth without really, thinking about the environmental consequences? What are the challenges for GGGI when it comes to partnering with them?
I often say, if you can't make the business case, stop talking. So if you can't go to an elected politician or to a CEO with a story, with a value proposition that makes sense from a political perspective and from an economic perspective, then you're not going to be believed. You're not going to be engaged. We can't feed the world purely on emotion. There has to be an economic rationale as well.
So it's not just about tree hugging and about loving the environment. You have to see, the green dollars at the end of it, right?
You have to see the green. You have to see the green dollars as well, and some of those green dollars are actually in hugging the tree, as opposed to cutting the tree down. I think most of the deforestation does not happen because people think trees are ugly and they need to be removed, but because there's an economic value in cutting trees down. So the fundamental challenge then is how can you make it more attractive economically for somebody to leave a tree standing rather than to cut it down. And it's, at the end of the day, as simple as making the business case. But part of the challenge around making that business case differently is trying to bring in that longer term perspective, trying to not be the goldfish in the bowl that has an attention span of 30 seconds, but trying to think a bit further ahead.
And you mentioned about the business habits. What is the most private sectors or the big businesses, especially the multinational corporations that practice around the world? Do you see them actually really embracing this idea of sustainability, of green growth, green economy, and doing well by doing good kind of philosophy?
Some of them do, some of them don't. I think the ones that are close to the consumer are most inclined to act on green because consumers care about green. So you see people that, consumer goods companies, for example, are very interested in sustainability, not only because their customers, their consumers care about it, but also because they need to preserve the ecosystems, the terrain from which their products come. For example, a decade ago, many companies were talking about supply chain management. Now many companies are talking about security of supply. with issues like climate change, food production, grain production, cocoa production is increasingly under pressure, and therefore companies like that have to think about security of supply and the sustainability of their business models. So I do see the corporate community engaging, especially the companies that are close to consumers. Some of the companies that are further away from consumers or more upstream, for example, mining companies, are less engaged. But they are feeling.
Although in some areas they have to engage with the local communities, for example.
Yeah,
if
they do.
Work around those.
They do, and you see places in the world, for example, in Latin America, where conflicts with local communities are costing extraction companies an awful lot of money. But corporates, of course, are not only under pressure from, well, first of all, corporates are not all evil, horrible people. They're humans, they have families, they have children, they care about the environment just like you and I do. But they need to make the business case at the same time. And I find that generally a lot of corporates are beginning to think differently and are interested in exploring new business models. I mean, to give you another example, there's a Peruvian economist called Hernando de Soto. I don't know if he's right or not, but he claims that there are 5 billion people on this planet who are completely undocumented in terms of their economic activity and even in terms of the very fact that they exist.
5 billion, that's out of 7 billion.
Well, we're heading slightly beyond that at the moment. So you can look at that as a huge problem, which it is in terms of a very large number of people outside society. You can also look at it as a potentially huge market and look at where things like mobile banking or small-scale renewables initiatives have gone in terms of accessing the kinds of markets that we don't even see as markets today. So there are also massive opportunities out there.
Okay, you mentioned consumers. Is consumer consciousness rising towards greater desire for better sourced products and so on? Is this a trend that you see is becoming sort of more prevalent in the world, and are people more concerned about what they eat, what they wear, and where it comes from? Or?
People are more concerned about the sustainability, about the health value, let's say, of what they buy, but they are still primarily driven by price. So that means that if you can put into the market a sustainable product which is competitive from a price perspective, then you have a distinct advantage. But to think that you can put into the market a pint of milk or something else which is twice as expensive but sustainable, your business is not going to last very long.
So you can't really push people to eat organic when the price of carrots, organic carrots, is a lot more expensive than regular GMO-grown carrots. But how do you make that into sort of an industrialized model, so to speak? Because at the end of the day, to bring down the cost of price, you have to cut down the cost of production, you have to cut down the cost of distribution, and so on and so forth. How can you create that, put that sustainability aspect and put in the low cost of price? Because these things are sourced differently, right? For example.
I think that's partly, no, not partly. I think that's significantly through partnership. It's not only about the relationship between corporates and consumers. There are more stakeholders at play. You talked a little bit earlier about the GMO carrot. We have a situation, for example, in Europe, where a lot of GMOs are not allowed into the market. So it's very difficult if you're a carrot producer in Tanzania to have one field of non-GMO carrots for the European market and then a field 5 meters away full of GMOs for another market. So in the same way that car producers don't produce poor standard cars for one market and good standard cars for a different market. So you do see that the standards that policymakers set influence the behavior of producers. You do see that the preferences of consumers influence the behavior of producers. You do see that in an interconnected internet world where everyone has access to information on everything, that corporates are more and more concerned about the views of civil society organizations and what they say about corporates. So in that sense, it's a much more interactive and much more engaged world, and that in turn, from a positive point of view, means that good partnerships around green growth can lead to real solutions.
Okay, let me ask you a question. For example, here in Indonesia, we eat a lot of tofu, tempeh, the soybean-based products, and then it's cheaper for us to actually import the soybeans from the US, for example, the GMO soybeans. And if you go to, for example, fruit markets, it's just full of apples from China, for example, and the local apples from the West Java or Central Java, nobody buys them because it's too expensive, and also it's not as attractive. Now, how, considering that the US and China, these two giants, and basically the rest of the world, we completely depend on them for cheap goods and available goods, how in the future can sustainable, the GGI, the works that you do, change this sort of pattern of farming where you give a chance for local farmers to also have some of that prosperity, have some of that advantage?
Well, there are a couple of questions there. One question is, to what extent are global issues like climate change going to make it possible for countries like China and the United States to continue to be major food exporters? Or are different models going to prevail? I come from this tiny, tiny, tiny little country in Europe called the Netherlands. And you were talking about the United States. The Netherlands, that tiny, tiny little country, is actually the second largest food exporter in the world, because of an entirely different model of agriculture and production that is much more sustainable. So I think that global trends are going to have an influence. I think that innovation in agriculture, in industry, is going to have an impact. And I think that there is a lot that we can do to help producers, including producers in Indonesia, to produce in a much more sustainable way and to reduce their costs. For example, we as GGGI are doing work in India, in Karnataka, on much more effective drip irrigation systems that actually not only mean that farmers use a lot less water, but they also significantly reduce the cost of agriculture. So it really is a matter of exploring multiple pathways.
And in the amount of volume that is needed.
And in the amount of volume that is needed. We still have a global population which is growing.
Going up, yeah. And this is something that is also a challenge too.
It's a challenge, but at the same time, I think we had, a lot of people talk about peak oil. I think we had peak baby a number of years ago. So the population is still increasing, but it's a residual increase. One of the major struggles that we're facing is aging, and another major struggle is urbanization. I don't see, even in Indonesia, a lot of 70 or 80-year-olds with
not yet.
Cultivating.
I think we still have another 15 to 20.
Sure, but I don't see them
window.
I don't see them in the fields. I don't see them pulling plows or. So in that sense, we're going to have to define systems of agriculture which are much more innovative, which are much less labor intensive.
You mentioned innovation and also technology, especially since, even though we're now in the digital age, still a lot of people, like you said, basically they're off the grid, so to speak. How can innovation, technology, and what sort of products or what sort of creative ideas can be generated that would support a sustainable and a green way of life?
I think the challenge is to think about markets and consumers differently. I don't know what the situation is in Indonesia.
We're getting there slowly, but our internet penetration has gone up.
Well, I mean, the example that I wanted to give is related to water. In many illegal settlements, in many slums in Africa, people pay much more for water than rich people do, because the poor people in the slums buy bottled water or they buy it from tankers, as opposed to getting it efficiently through pipe systems. So can you find efficient ways of delivering water at price to slum dwellers? Many poor people pay a lot more for electricity or for light than rich people do, because they're buying kerosene rather than buying electricity. A significant root of the problem there is that those poor people are spending a lot of money on a day-to-day basis because they don't have a borrowing capacity. So can you find models to deliver water or to deliver energy whereby you get people to pay on a day-by-day basis as opposed to by month, and you offer them more renewable sources of energy and water? So that's one example. There are also examples of people that manufacture washing powder that are putting the washing powder in packets this big instead of packets this big, because poor people can afford the packet this big but not the packet that big. Then there's internet banking in Africa, medical health services now via the internet in many parts of the world. So it's very much thinking about how can I access people differently. What is the purchasing power of people? How can I tap into new markets in different ways?
And also, what about the creative use of waste? Because, you know, we as consumers, you know, one thing that we're very good at is we're very good at creating waste, and a lot of the waste is, especially here, like in Indonesia, and particularly in big cities, it's waste or garbage. It's becoming a very noxious problem, you know, literally. Well, how can technology help, for example, in mitigating some of these, you know, the negative aspects of consumerism, which is literally drowning us in waste?
Well, actually, some of the work that we as GGGI are going to be doing in Indonesia in the future is going to be focused on how can you use waste products in a more positive way, for example, for energy generation. So you do see people or companies turning waste into methane, and methane being a fuel. We see electronic waste being recycled, we see plastic being recycled, and new technologies being developed to make that possible. So in that sense, products that were considered to be of no value and purely waste in the past are now demonstrating a real value. And the best example to my mind is Europe, not in terms of what it's doing, but in terms of what it's planning to do. The European economy is one of the most resource-intensive economies in the world, but Europe as a region is one of the resource-poorest regions of the world. So if Europe can focus more strongly on recycling, it's actually a win-win-win, in the sense that you rely less on resources from abroad, you have less waste, and you grow your economy through innovation.
So you mentioned that also when GGGI works with governments or with countries, you sort of tailor-made to their needs. I mean, every country has its particular needs and also particular challenges. And in Indonesia, I mean, we are well known as one of the the largest emitters of carbon, and also at the same time we are an archipelago. So when it comes to you know, natural disasters, so we're very much prone to it. But at the same time, we do need our growth. We're still the welfare that we need to give to the people is still well below expectation. We still need to grow maybe 6 or 7%. Particularly for Indonesia, what are the areas do you think that you can focus more on and helping the government, particularly in developing projects that are appropriate for our needs, that are sustainable and economically viable?
Well, like most organizations, we can't be good at everything. So we have a number of areas which we focus on, and we've chosen as an organization to focus on energy, on green cities, on land use, and on water, and not try to do everything, because then we'd probably do everything badly as opposed to a few things well. In Indonesia, we're basically focusing on three sets of activities: on energy, on land use, and on new economic zones. So in energy, the focus is on shifting more towards renewables, more to energy efficiency, to creating business models, business propositions around renewables and around energy efficiency. In the land use and forestry area, it's about making a business case for the preservation of forest, but also about exploiting ecosystems, services, different models of agriculture and of land use, really creating jobs, creating value in different ways. And then in terms of the economic zones, it's a sort of, it's two questions really. It's one, how do you run the economic zone itself? Does it run according to a sustainable model? And there are examples, for example, sorry to come back to the Netherlands all the time, but the example of Rotterdam, where a ship has to meet a certain emission standard, otherwise it's not even allowed into the port. So how do you run an economic zone itself? And secondly, the question, what does that economic zone mean for the people that work in it and live around it? Can an economic zone be a model that creates prosperity for the people that live around that zone in greener, in different, in more innovative ways?
So you basically work together with the various departments, related to whether it's land or economic zones or forest or energy. Is that how it works? I mean, how do things get discussed? Where do ideas come from? And particularly when it comes to the funding aspect, how does it actually work for the project to get from planning to implementation at the end of the day?
Well, we work with a number of agencies at the national level. So we work with Bappenas, we work with Environment, we work with the energy people, a new agency that has been created that focuses on peatland restoration. So we have partners at the national level. We also do work together with a number of provinces, so we work at the provincial level. And what we're increasingly beginning to do is to work together with the private sector. And at the same time, GGGI as a global organization is working together with the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation to develop different finance models. So our ambition really is to connect partners at the international, the national and the local level to develop business models that are green but economically viable at the same time.
Share with us perhaps your experience and, have there been sort of challenges that have been quite difficult when it comes to getting, ideas implemented and plans developed? Because I have to admit, Indonesia, we're very good with targets and ambitions, but when it comes to implementation, sometimes it gets lost in the translation, or it gets lost in and just things don't really get done as fast as well as we hoped.
Well, I think there's a saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so having great ambitions but not delivering on them is not a unique experience. The struggles are there every day, and many of those struggles relate to what we began our conversation with, which is the short-term preoccupation of many political and business leaders, the pressure they feel to deliver economic results today or tomorrow, but not the day after. And at the same time, the perception that a number of global issues like climate change, which in our hearts we feel are very important, we also think we can maybe worry about tomorrow as opposed to today. Which is why the challenge really is about making a business proposition developing a business proposition that makes sound sense.
Okay, give me an example. For example, for land issues, which is, there's always land issues is basically a lot of the problems that we face in this country is because of land issues, whether it's land use, whether it's being used for plantation or whether it's for infrastructure and so on and so forth. How would you come up with something that is both good for the community or the people living around the area, but at the same time they can contribute to the economic health of the country?
Yeah. Well, thank you for picking on a really easy example to give.
Oh, maybe I'll have some more difficult ones coming up.
I mean, deforestation, which is still a big issue in Indonesia.
It's huge. We burn a lot of our
Well, a lot of it
trees,
gets burnt, but a lot of the deforestation around the world happens because of the value of wood and the value of tropical wood. The problem is that tropical trees take an awfully long time to grow, so once you cut it down, it's gone. And I think we can already demonstrate as an organization that there is actually value in preserving forests, that there is value in providing ecosystem services, including around tourism, and that in those places where you're talking more about land use management, that there are actually sustainable agricultural practices or forest restoration practices that can actually bring a lot of jobs and economic benefits to people immediately. So if you can show that, and I think we can show that cutting a forest down delivers, yes, a very big but very short-term return, whereas acting in a more sustainable way will give you a long-term return on investment that is much better for society. If you can make that case convincingly, you have no problem getting society on your side, and you have much less of a problem getting politicians and business leaders on your side.
Pertemuan 35 negara anggota, ratusan profesional menentukan target pembangunan sekaligus perbaikan lingkungan hingga tahun 2020.
Energi terbarukan seperti energi surya, energi angin, energi atau biomasa, ya, dan yang lain-lain itu sangat mungkin dikembangkan. Dulu orang malas mengembangkan karena mahal, investasinya mahal, harga jualnya mahal. Sekarang tidak, kecenderungannya makin murah. Energi surya itu makin murah, ongkos produksinya murah, harga jualnya juga akan makin murah.
Kerjasama antara PT Sarana Multi Infrastruktur dengan Global Green Growth akhirnya terrealisasi untuk pembangunan pembangkit listrik tenaga surya. 50 megawatt untuk proyek pertama membutuhkan anggaran sebesar 150 juta dolar Amerika Serikat.
Di dalam perjanjian cooperation agreement itu masing-masing pihak akan menyumbangkan resource-nya, sumber dayanya, baik dalam sumber daya maksudnya knowledge ataupun resource sumber daya manusia yang ada di masing-masing pihak, dan juga budget yang mesti dipersiapkan untuk menyiapkan proyek tersebut. Nah, pada akhirnya nanti persiapan ini akan kerjasama juga dengan pengembang di proyek tersebut. Kebetulan pengembangnya adalah BUMN juga yang memang melakukan pengelolaan kawasan pariwisata di Lombok.
Pemerintah lewat Bappenas yang sudah menentukan rencana Green Growth sejak tahun 2013 akan mengganti tata cara dalam koridor kebijakan untuk mempercepat proses realisasi perjanjian Paris.
Kami melihat dengan kita fokus pada sustainable growth, green growth, maka kita yakin bahwa dibanding business as usual, apakah tahun 2020-2025, pertama tentunya kita ingin menurunkan tingkat emisi, tapi kedua yang lebih penting adalah kita tetap mendapatkan pertumbuhan, tapi pertumbuhan yang lebih berkesinambungan.
Saat ini, Indonesia baru menyerap 5 juta dolar Amerika Serikat dari 131 juta dolar Amerika Serikat yang dikucurkan untuk merencanakan proyek pembangunan pembangkit listrik tenaga surya dan pengembangan energi terbarukan lainnya bersama 5 negara lain. Silvano Hajid, Jeju, Korea Selatan.
And the other thing that we are facing major challenge on is energy. I mean, the government has this plan to 35,000 megawatts of electricity. I mean, our need for power is very underserved at the moment, and one of the reasons why, because the investment in power is expensive, and when you have a cost, it's much higher than, for example, the price of electricity that you sell, then whereas in Indonesia we need to actually light up our regional areas, and we can't afford to sell the electricity at a higher competitive price. I mean, what can be done to solve these two things? On the one hand, there's people's need for electricity at the basic level. On the other hand, we need a lot of electricity to power our economic growth and power our industries.
Yeah. Well, you rightly pointed to the undeniable fact that Indonesia is an archipelago nation, so lots and lots of little islands. And lots of little islands mean that you have to have a significantly decentralized model of power generation. There's no point stringing wires across thousands of islands. That gets very expensive. So you have to decentralize power generation. So you can do that with small-scale conventional power generation, or you can think about small-scale solar. And we are getting to the point in many parts of the world where renewable sources of energy are already competitive with conventional power generation. So in Indonesia's case, as an island nation, there are real possibilities to look at wind, at solar, decentralized solar energy as an alternative to diesel or kerosene or other forms of power generation. At the same time, in those parts of the country that are connected to the grid, there's a huge potential for energy efficiency by getting the people that are using energy at the moment to use a lot less of it because they can. And at the same time, there are real possibilities to generate power in more renewable ways. Earlier in the conversation, we talked about the fact that, yes, coal is very cheap at the moment, but that money is very cheap at the moment as well. So there really isn't a better time than the present to invest in renewables, in wind and in solar. Yes, the upfront cost will be high, but after that you can run the systems for 20 to 30 years almost for free. Whereas if you choose coal or oil or something else, another fossil fuel instead, you will be going to the shop to buy that every week for the next 20 to 30 years. And there is no way that you can predict what the price is going to be.
Can you give us some example of the energy projects that you're developing or together with the government, or that can be implemented in a very short term?
Well, at the moment we are looking at the real alternatives of waste products, biomass as an alternative source of energy, and off-grid small-scale renewable energy as an alternative to coal. So that's something that we're beginning to look at in Indonesia. As I said, we're in the phase of transitioning from integrating green growth into policy making and from capacity building into actual implementation. So our focus very much in the second phase of our work with Indonesia is going to be around developing real investment models. But there are plenty of other countries around the world, in India, in Ethiopia, even in countries like Rwanda, where we're already beginning to work on real business cases, on real business models for a different direction.
You mentioned the other focus is on special economic zones. Could you share which particular zones you're going to be focusing on for the next phase?
No, I can't because I don't know. Ask Anna.
Well, and a global, when you pick on projects, to develop projects, and this is not just in Indonesia, it's all over the world. What should it have, and then what is the best way of actually monitoring or making sure that things are being done the way they're supposed to be, and with the results that are expected? Especially when there's a lot of funding, a lot of money's gone into it. And obviously, there has to be some kind of measure of success.
Oh, absolutely. But a measure of success begins with a definition of success, because you have to know how you define success and what you measure success against. So what we always go through a very systematic process of first macroeconomic assessment, looking at the green growth opportunities that a country has, in which sectors of the economy does it have potential for green growth, what shape should that green growth take, what kinds of policies need to be put in place, and then we come to programs, to projects, to actual implementation. So at the end of the day, we have very complicated or very extensive or very thorough, depends how you want to call them, systems of evaluation where we look at how have emissions of greenhouse gases been reduced, how have jobs been created, who have those jobs been created for, Has the cost of transportation gone down? Has the cost of water gone down? Do more people have jobs in the agricultural sector? So green growth is about strong economic growth that is more socially inclusive while having less negative impact on the environment. So basically we measure everything that we do against those through three main sets of parameters.
Okay, Yvo, since it was first created, 2012, is it the Global Green Growth Institute, until now in the 4 years, what would you say has it, the work that the GGGI has done around the world, is it met up, with expectations, with targets, and do you feel that the Institute has made big changes when it comes to putting the world more in the path of sustainability? And you have, contributed, according to the dream that the Institute was set up to chase, so to speak.
Well, we haven't fulfilled the dream, fortunately, but I think for a 4-year-old, we're not doing badly. Since we were created in 2012, our membership has grown enormously, our funding base has grown enormously, the number of countries that we work in has increased. So we've shown steady progress, but sadly we're still very much a drop in the bucket. There are still huge challenges ahead of us, which is why I hope we can continue as an organization to play a role in explaining that green growth is a real alternative to brown growth.
Okay. Well, you've convinced me there.
Good.
Yvo, well, thank you so much for your insight. It's very interesting, very useful. And let's hope with what's happening in the world now, with all the conflicts and the climate change and all the various setbacks and challenges, but we still remain on the path of actually living on this planet sustainably, that we're not, eating ourselves out of our resources and finding ourselves poorer in the future in order so that we can be richer at the moment. So the key thinking is very much a long-term thing, isn't it?
Yes, and ambition rather than hope.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.